that?
Yes, I would like to answer that in a bit longish term. The problem with these negotiations is this distrust between the developing and the developed nations, and vice versa. They don't trust each other. Well, so to say, we don't trust each other. Because there is enmity between the countries, also stemming from the political scene. It is carried into the climate change conflict.
So climate issues becoming political
yes, and that is bad because they are starting to negotiate not in substance of what is needed to mitigate the climate threat. So we want to give an element of trust to build up trust, and I think Indonesia is
in a good position
because we don't have any extreme enemies. Well, we have a lot of friends, but not extreme enemies. So we can negotiate, we can interlocute between one and the other.
But are you optimistic that because Copenhagen was not very successful, there was, you know, China on one side and then the US on the other side, and are you optimistic that there will be concrete results, there will be agreement?
Yes. So that is that's the big point. What is a success? And what kind of agreements are we?
Real targets.
Yes. If we want an agreement like we have in Bali, it is almost impossible because Bali is quite unique, well, if I may say so. Because since the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, the next legally binding agreement worldwide is in Bali. After that, nothing.
The Bali Roadmap. Yeah.
The Bali Roadmap. So we are trying to figure out what kind of agreements can we negotiate so it gives the benefit to the world after all. So we hope to have a partial agreement, what we are terming now as building blocks of agreements that eventually will become a worldwide legally binding agreement.
So the best that you can hope is this partial agreement.
Partial agreements.
But what about things like targets? You know, targets for carbon
right. So the partial agreements, of course, being Indonesian, I would imagine, or I would like to strive for or maneuver that we have the best of it. Indonesia has the best of it. That points out to funding for the mitigation and reforestation, to give adaptation programs to the poor, and all those things that are inherently Indonesian. And I think we are getting there because, like I said, the substance is already agreed upon. It is the atmosphere that is not good.
Okay. But for us, for Indonesia, obviously you mentioned funding. How much funding do we actually need to implement REDD? And also, where can we get access to the funding from?
Well, there are two kinds of funding, or three kinds. One is bilateral, because many countries, they see Indonesia as an outlet of their kind of enthusiasm or their strive for climate change mitigations. The second is international funding, which will be decreed by the agreements that is agreed upon in the UNFCCC negotiations. And the third is the private, like the CDM funding, which also can yield Indonesia, because Indonesia has a great potential for making programs that are funded by the private sector. So there are three kinds of funding, all is welcome.
Peatland degradation and forest fires that have put Indonesia among the top 3 largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. Indonesia has a great interest in climate change, not only as the host of COP13, where the Bali Action Plan for Combating Climate Change was drawn up, but also as a developing country that is committed to an ambitious plan to reduce her carbon emission, even though it is not mandatory. This is because Indonesia stands to be greatly affected by any change in weather pattern and climate changes. As an archipelago and still a largely rural nation, the country has much to lose when the climate becomes increasingly unpredictable. Prolonged droughts, increased frequency in extreme weather events, and heavy rainfall leading to big floods, all these will have serious consequences to a country where 40% of the population is still dependent on agriculture, and where any changes in seasonal patterns and unpredictable weather will leave farmers grappling with crop failures. Rising sea levels, for example, are expected to submerge islands and flood arable paddy fields across the archipelago. Even cities such as the Jakarta Bay Area are vulnerable to inundation that has a negative impact on both people and the environment. Moreover, Indonesia's rich biodiversity is also at risk and could lead to harmful effects on agriculture, fishery and forestry, and threaten the people's food security and livelihoods. But Indonesia too must work hard to reduce carbon emission that is the primary cause of global warming and resulting climate change. As a developing nation with large amounts of tropical forests, Indonesia is guilty of extensive deforestation, peatland degradation, and forest fires that have put Indonesia among the top 3 largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. Carbon emissions resulting from deforestation and forest fires are 5 times those from non-forestry emissions. Meanwhile, though emissions from energy and industrial sectors are relatively small, Indonesia's continuously advancing economy means that these emissions are also growing at a rapid pace. In order for Indonesia to achieve her ambitious carbon reduction target of 26% by 2020 without undermining development, however, the country needs commitments from industrialized countries and for access to funding.
What kind of credibility do we have as a country which is one of the biggest emitters of carbon?
That's a good question. So I think the best rule is if you do something, you have to walk the talk. So we try to behave.
Are we walking the talk?
Well, we are, because the figures show that we are progressing. Although we are still big emitters, but we have gained a lot of ground. And it is witnessed by the publication of the Chatham House studies that has shown that the illegal loggers have greatly decreased since 4 years ago. So we are making progress, and that is why we are trying to put an example. We have to lead by example. We are bad country in that aspect. We are better, so we want to expect everybody else to become better.
And one of the things that to prove that we have good commitment is our very ambitious targets compared to other countries, or the fact that we don't really need to have such ambitious targets to reduce by 26% in 2020. And what is the basis of that, and how realistic?
The basis is because the developed countries are saying what they want to do, but they don't do it. Whilst the developing countries, they don't have to. Like you said, it is quite voluntary. We have calculated that with some effort, maybe big effort, we can get 26% cut in emissions. And that gives a highlight.
How?
First of all, we are focusing on the forestry sector. Suppressing forest fires, and stopping the land conversion, and stopping the fires in the peatlands, and better agricultural methods. And this is carefully calculated so we can get the 26% in 2020. And that's not the end of the story, because with international assistance, we can have 41% of business as usual.
And these are all put into part and parcel of government climate policy?
Yes, it is decreed. It will be decreed in the presidential decree. At this moment, it's a ministerial decree.
However, rich nations have done very little within the Kyoto Protocol to reduce emissions by any meaningful amount, while they are all for pressuring developing countries to agree to emissions targets. From floods in Pakistan and China to fires in Russia, natural disasters due to extreme weather patterns are becoming common images on our television screens across the world. Heavy rainfalls, droughts, melting glaciers, erratic seasons, and other unpredictable climate changes are becoming less uncommon. Climate change is indeed a global phenomenon and in theory the perfect topic for an international environmental agreement. After all countries are affected by and contribute to the build-up of greenhouse gases and should be willing to join in the effort to stop it. However, it is far from easy to agree what to do and how to do it. The challenge is to use far less fossil fuel energy while increasing standards of living in developing countries and avoiding the sort of cuts in standards of living in developed countries that would produce public backlash and political impasse, as seen in the US inability to commit to clear and accountable targets. The key principle of climate change negotiations frameworks are on common but differentiated responsibilities. This recognizes that since historically industrialized nations have emitted far more greenhouse gas emissions, rich countries face the biggest responsibility and burden for action to address climate change. Rich countries therefore must support developing nations adopt green policies. However, rich nations have done very little within the Kyoto Protocol to reduce emissions by any meaningful amount, while they are all for pressuring developing countries to agree to emissions targets. Actually, industrialized nations can help pay off their carbon debt by truly helping emerging countries develop along a cleaner path, such as through technology transfer, finance, and capacity building. In effect, the more they delay, the more the poor nations will have to face the adverse impact of erratic weather and climate disasters on their own, and the more the developed countries would need to lend a hand in the long run. It is to be hoped that COP16 in Cancun would result in a clear and agreed roadmap on how the world combats the threats of climate change. To find out about the possible outcome of COP16 in Cancun, I asked Miguel Fredes, an environmentalist and climate expert based in Jakarta, what his thoughts are about the climate change summit.
Okay, about COP16 in Mexico, yeah, there is some optimism that some agreement will be achieved. How do you see yourself? How do you analyze the situation? What will they agree on, do you think? And are you also optimistic that something more concrete will come out of that meeting than what we've seen in Copenhagen?
I used to be very optimistic before Copenhagen. I'm now realistic, and I think that it would be very difficult to achieve an agreement to I like the wording of Pat Ruckman related to become operational. The developed countries are not really materializing the agreement. Therefore, if in the next meeting before preparation of Cancun, we see that the developed countries and developing countries are not really finalizing the commitment on emission targets and willing to make them binding, I would say that there are a big chance of opportunities that Cancun can fail again. That will stop the process, and I am optimistic on the side of the developing countries because they will need to agree to continue make voluntary efforts for the same reason I mentioned to you before. They need to face climate change as the developed countries are not forced to do it. It will be important because Indonesia is the pilot country for the concept that is called RED.
there's no longer any question that climate change is central to the political thinking of every country on the planet. Now, the question is whether a global summit within a UN framework could come up with a global agreement that is acceptable to every country and binding in nature. Or perhaps at the end of the day, when it comes to climate change issues, it's best done through intergovernmental negotiations and implementation by each country's green policy. Although that would be difficult to measure in terms of success on a global scale. So how do you see Indonesia and Indonesia's target and Indonesia's role and Indonesia's contribution to the climate change conference?
First, I'm optimistic about Indonesia for the reason that the amount of Indonesia now is like when you change into childhood to you become an adolescent, and you understand that you have more rights, but you have more responsibilities. And I think I'm very amazed to see people in Indonesia, from the government, NGOs, private sector, really engaging in catching up with simple concepts of climate change. And the responsibilities are very demanding. And I would say that the role of Indonesia will be very important. It will be important because Indonesia is the pilot country for the concept that is called REDD, which is reducing emission for deforestation and forest degradation. And if Indonesia is capable to implement a transparent, just, efficient model, this can be replicated in other countries who suffer the same problem. So that involves policy and also democracy issues. So the role of Indonesia could be, and that's why you see governments like Australia, the United States, Germany, Norway, the UK working, you know, in partnership with Indonesia, because they know that the role of Indonesia will be very important, not only for climate change, but also for development.
Okay, maybe just one final question. We see floods in Pakistan, floods in China, fire in Russia. These are real climate disasters, climate-related disasters. And then you have a UN-based conference or meeting where people argue about what to do about climate changes. But somehow I just don't see the connection about what is actually happening in the world and the time we are spending in trying to negotiate creating targets on how to reduce carbon emission and reducing climate change. How do you see that?
Well, nobody really faces a problem unless you see the problems. If you're sitting in front of your screen or you are watching TV, you don't feel climate change. So the opportunity now is to, through the media, through the stakeholders, through the government, to really start to understand that we live in a very interdependent world, and everything that happens in one part will affect the other part. So we live in a planet in which if climate change temperature increase, we have all, as a world, very severe consequences, not only flooding, not only problems with increasing amount of rain or cold or heat, but basically problems that affect the economy and the survival of communities. When you start to realize and make the connections of flooding in Pakistan, the desertification process in another country, shortage of water in another part, and then the problem of rice, which is very important for Asian countries, you relate those, and then you try to understand that climate change is happening, and this will affect directly the daily life of all of us. So that's why it's so important to really make efforts at all stages with all stakeholders to really address climate change.
And the UN is a good umbrella for this, do you think?
The confusion is the UN is not only the only umbrella, and I think there's so much hope on the targets and the goals and achievements, outcomes of the UN. But I think that is a little bit naive, and we should work towards involving G20. The G20 have responsibility as the local government or the council in Padang or the excuse me, the neighborhood or the school. Everybody have a little responsibility over climate change.
From the 29th of November until the 10th of December, the UN Summit on Climate Change, or COP16, will be held in Cancun, Mexico. And we can only hope that the summit will be able to deliver concrete and targeted results that will be able to tackle the challenges of climate change, so that the countries could move forward and implement effective green policies that will be able to put Earth's interest first ahead of that of global politics. And that's all for tonight's episode. Don't forget to join me next month to meet another influential figure who makes a difference to our lives on Face to Face with Desi Anwar, bringing you the world.